Hey there, and welcome to a deep dive on something that I think we all think about a lot. How do we feel good and be productive at the same time? How do we get things done without running purely on stress and fumes and actually, enjoy the process? We asked you to send in stuff from the books, Feel Good Productivity and The Batman Effect. And wow, you guys did not disappoint. I'm excited to get into it.
Yeah, it's so common to think that to be productive, we have to sacrifice our well-being. But actually, they're way more connected than we realize.
Totally, right.
Yeah.
Like we've all had those days where we're super productive, but we're running on stress and caffeine, or we're completely relaxed, but we get absolutely nothing done.
Right, right.
The first book, Feel Good Productivity, starts with a really interesting story about a doctor who had this realization after a really, really tough Christmas Day shift at the hospital. And it was basically that just working harder wasn't making him a better doctor at all, just a more exhausted one.
It's so easy to confuse activity with actual productivity. We've all been there. There's actually a really classic psychology experiment that shows this. So imagine you're given just a candle, some matches, and a handful of thumbtacks.
Hmm.
And you're given this task: figure out how to attach the lit candle to a cork board so that no wax drips.
Sounds kind of simple, right?
Oh no, I'm already stumped.
Right. And most people really struggle with this. But what's so interesting is that people who are given a small reward before, or, are just primed to feel some positive emotions, they tend to solve it way faster.
Is that because they're less stressed about having to find the right answer, so they're able to be more creative?
Exactly. They're more open to possibilities, to thinking outside the box. And this actually connects to what psychologist Barbara Fredrickson calls the broaden and build theory.
Okay.
And that theory basically says that it's not just that positive emotions feel good, which of course they do, but they actually broaden our thinking and help us build our resources for, things like resilience and creativity. So it's not just about feeling good. It's about how feeling good actually changes the way our brain works and makes us more adaptable, more creative, and ultimately more effective.
Exactly.
I love that. Okay, so the book then goes on to explore what it calls three energizers for this kind of feel-good productivity:
Yeah.
play, power, and people. And I'm very curious about this idea of play because I feel like, as adults, we're kind of conditioned to think of play as something we do as kids, not so much as adults with
All
deadlines.
right.
How does that work?
Totally. It's a common misconception. The book actually starts with a story about Richard Feynman, the famous
Oh,
physicist.
yeah?
And, brilliant guy, Nobel Prize winner, but he actually hit a wall where his work just felt like a total chore.
Oh, I remember this. This is where he rediscovers the joy of his work by approaching it playfully.
Hmm.
Didn't he become, like, obsessed with a wobbling plate in the cafeteria? And that led to some groundbreaking discovery.
Yes, and that's the point. Sometimes we need to reframe work as play to unlock that creativity and intrinsic motivation. And again, it's not about gooping off, but about bringing a sense of exploration and genuine curiosity back into what we're doing.
So, like, how do we actually do that?
Hmm.
Especially those of us who, like, don't necessarily see ourselves as the super playful type.
Well, the book talks about different play personalities we might have. Dr. Stuart Brown, who's done a lot of research on play, identifies 8 different types. From the collector who loves gathering information or objects to the joker who loves humor and making other people laugh.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah.
So it's about figuring out what energizes you, what brings you joy, and then finding those little ways to weave those things into your works. So for me, I love to learn new things, so maybe I approach a project as a research expedition instead of just another thing I have to cross off my to-do list.
Exactly. Or, say, if you love a little competition, maybe you gamify your tasks. The point is, find what works for you, experiment. Don't be afraid to play around with different approaches.
That makes a lot of sense. It's about making work feel less like work,
Right.
right? Like more like an extension of who you already are, what you're drawn to.
Exactly.
Exactly. Okay, so we've talked about play. What about the second energizer, power? What do they mean by that?
Yeah, and to be clear, it's not about power over others, but more about feeling empowered in your own life, having a sense of agency. And there's a really cool study in the book where women who were told they were physically fit actually enjoyed exercising more, even when it got tough.
Wait, really?
Yeah.
So it's like the power of belief, of self-efficacy, actually changing their experience.
Exactly. And the book gets into different techniques for boosting that feeling of self-efficacy. Like they talk about something called the confidence switch.
Oh, interesting. Tell me about this confidence switch.
It's going to sound super simple, maybe even a little silly, but it's basically acting as if you're already confident. Visualize yourself successfully completing a task, embody that confidence, and it can actually lead to better performance.
So it's kind of like that fake it till you make it idea, but
Mm,
with a little more like intention behind it. You're not just pretending, but you're actually changing that internal narrative.
yes.
Exactly.
Oh, that's so good.
And another really powerful one is something they call the social model method. And this one I love because it highlights how we can draw inspiration from other people.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, it basically suggests that by observing other people succeed, especially people we see as similar to ourselves, we can actually boost our own belief that we can do it too.
Yeah, it's like this vicarious confidence boost we get. You
Mhm.
see someone else do it, and suddenly it expands your own sense of what's possible. There was this study where they had kids watch a video of someone climbing a wall, and then those kids were more likely to successfully climb that same wall themselves. Like, you just seeing it done made a difference.
Wow. It's like proof of concept, but for our own potential. I love that.
Huh.
Okay, so we've talked about play and power as energizers for this feel-good productivity.
Mm.
What about the third one, people?
Right. So this section of the book is all about the power of having good relationships
Hmm.
and, how those relationships can actually impact our productivity for the better. It's about finding your scene, the book calls it, your community, the people who get you, who inspire you, who support you. The musician Brian Eno had this great term for it. He called it scenius, that feeling of like collective genius that can emerge when you're part of a thriving, supportive group.
Genius. I love that word.
Right.
And it makes so much sense. We're not really meant to do this thing called life alone, right? Like even small acts of kindness, helping each other out, those things have a ripple effect.
Totally. There's actually a scientific basis for this, helping others trigger something called a helper's high in the brain.
No way, really.
It releases these feel-good chemicals, oxytocin, dopamine. So, doing something kind for someone else is a win-win. It boosts their mood and yours, and it strengthens those social connections, which are so important for well-being.
I love that. I'm thinking about little ways I can incorporate that more into my day, like sending a quick thank you note to a colleague, offering to help someone out with a project. Sometimes, it's the little things.
Exactly, exactly. And on that note, the book talks about the importance of getting better at asking for help ourselves.
Okay. Yeah.
And it actually highlights this really fascinating concept called the Benjamin Franklin effect. Have you heard of this?
Okay. The Benjamin Franklin effect. That rings a bell, but refresh my memory.
So it sounds totally counterintuitive, but apparently asking someone for a favor can actually make them like you more.
Really?
Yeah.
See, that does seem counterintuitive. Why would that be?
Yeah, it's kind of wild, right? But it ties into this idea of reciprocity. We as humans, we fundamentally like to be helpful.
Huh.
And when someone asks for our help, it makes us feel valued, appreciated. It creates this sense of connection and kind of, I guess, obligation
So,
that can actually strengthen the relationship.
so it's not about being needy or demanding, but it's more about like acknowledging that we all need a little help sometimes,
Yeah.
or being willing to put ourselves out there and ask for it. That's
Yes.
kind of a cool perspective shift.
Exactly, exactly.
Yeah.
And then finally, the book wraps up by emphasizing the importance of over communication.
Huh.
And not just like, in terms of just being clear, but also in terms of creating a culture of openness and trust within, our work environments, our teams, our relationships. So it's about celebrating successes together, both big and small. And then also, when things aren't going well, being candid about challenges in a way that feels constructive and supportive.
Yeah, that really resonates with me. I feel like we focus so much on like how to deliver bad news well, or we kind of just avoid it altogether. But there's this whole other side of like celebrating the wins, sharing that openly, which can be so motivating.
Absolutely. It's about creating a feedback loop that's rooted in both candor and kindness. And ultimately, that leads to stronger relationships and a more positive, productive work environment.
Love it. Okay, so much good stuff in that first book. Now, I'm really curious to dive into the Batman effect.
Yeah.
This one's all about tackling a huge productivity killer for a lot of us, and that is fear.
Ugh, yes, fear. It's so powerful and it can pop up in so many ways. Procrastination, perfectionism, imposter syndrome.
Yes to all of those. And, I have to say, I was reading that anecdote in the book about Alex Honnold, the free solo rock climber.
Oh, yeah.
who scales those insane cliffs without ropes.
I know. It's
It
unbelievable.
just blew my mind. Talk
Yeah.
about facing your fears head on.
Right.
I mean, I get nervous just thinking about it.
I know, I know. It turns out he actually has an underactive amygdala, which is the part of our brains responsible for the fear response. So he's literally wired differently.
Yeah.
But for most of us mere mortals, fear is a very real and present obstacle.
Oh, yeah, for sure. But what I appreciate about this book is it doesn't just tell you to, like, don't be afraid, which is obviously easier said than done. It actually gives you tools, practical strategies for understanding your fear, reducing it, maybe even harnessing it to your advantage.
Exactly.
I like that.
It's not about the absence of fear, but the courage to act in spite of it. And it all starts with really understanding what it is we're afraid of.
So true. Like, one technique I thought was really interesting was this idea of the emotion label.
Oh, yeah. Uh-huh.
It's such a simple concept. But the book explains that just simply naming our fears can actually make them less intimidating.
It's about bringing those fears out of the shadows into the light of awareness. Because, when we try to ignore them, suppress them, they just tend to loom larger in our minds. But when we acknowledge them, we name them, we examine them, that's when they often lose a bit of their power over us.
It's like that saying, you can't run from your problems.
Right.
Sometimes the best way to overcome something is to just face it head on.
Exactly. And the book actually mentions a study where people with arachnophobia, so fear of spiders,
Oh, no.
and I know, so they had them do this exercise where they had to label their emotions while interacting with a tarantula.
Oh, my gosh. Okay, that just sounds terrifying, but I'm curious what happened.
Well, the group that labeled their emotions was actually able to get closer to the spider, and they reported feeling less fear overall.
Wow. So just acknowledging the fear actually helped to lessen its grip.
Exactly. Exactly. It's powerful stuff. And another technique that really resonated with me was the idea of identity labels, those limiting beliefs we often carry around about ourselves.
Oh, yes. Tell me about it. Like, I'm not a creative person or I'm bad at math.
Yes, those. And they can be so insidious because they feel so true, but they can really hold us back.
Totally.
So the book encourages us to challenge those labels and instead adopt more of a growth mindset. Recognizing that our abilities aren't fixed, they can be developed with effort and experience.
It's that whole, like, instead of saying, I'm not good at this, it's saying, I'm not good at this yet.
Yeah,
Like, that little shift in language can make a huge difference.
exactly. It's about embracing the journey of learning and growth, rather than seeing ourselves as this, finished product.
Yes, I love that. Okay, so we've talked about reframing our thoughts, gaining perspective. But what about when those fears just feel really big, overwhelming? Like, what are some things we can do in the moment to manage those feelings?
Yeah, totally. And the book actually offers a bunch of different techniques for that. But one that I found really helpful is something called the 10-10-10 rule.
Oh, yeah. Tell me more about that one. I've heard of that.
Okay, so it's basically a tool for gaining perspective. So when you're, feeling anxious or afraid about something, ask yourself, how much will this matter in 10 minutes? In 10 weeks?
Yeah.
In 10 years?
Oh, wow. Yeah, it's amazing how that little shift in perspective can totally change how we feel about something.
Totally.
Yeah.
And often the things that seem so huge in the moment, if we zoom out, they're actually pretty insignificant in the grand scheme of things. It helps us to prioritize our energy and focus on what really matters.
It's like zooming out to see the bigger picture.
Yeah.
I like that. Okay, so we've talked about, like, reframing our thoughts, gaining perspective. But what about when that self-doubt creeps in, and we start to question our own abilities? How do we boost our confidence, especially when it matters most?
Yeah, that's where the book talks about the confidence equation.
Okay.
Basically, it explains that our level of confidence is often determined by this very simple formula. Confidence equals ability minus standard. So, if our perceived ability is higher than the perceived standard of the task, then we feel confident, right? But when that perceived ability falls short of the standard, that's when the self-doubt starts to creep in.
Makes sense.
Right.
Yeah.
So the book suggests that we can actually shift to this equation in our favor in a couple of ways. So we can either increase our perceived ability
Okay.
or adjust our perception of the standard.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah. So for example, if you're feeling, intimidated by a big project, instead of focusing on the enormity of it all, you can break it down into smaller, more manageable steps.
Right.
Which then increases your sense of ability to actually tackle each one.
Totally.
Right.
Or we can reframe our perception of the standard itself. So instead of comparing ourselves to, like, some idealized version of perfection, We focus on progress over perfection.
Yes.
We remind ourselves that everyone makes mistakes. We don't have to have all the answers right away.
Exactly. It's about being kind to ourselves, especially when we're struggling, celebrating the progress we're making, however small, and recognizing that setbacks are just a normal part of the learning process.
Yes, it's like giving ourselves the grace and understanding that we would offer to, like, a friend or a colleague.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And beyond these mental shifts, the book also stresses that action is a really powerful antidote to fear.
Okay.
Because often we get so caught up in overthinking and analyzing, we never actually get started.
Analysis paralysis.
Yes, exactly. So taking action, even small steps, can be incredibly empowering because every time we face that fear and we take action anyway, it builds our confidence, our resilience.
Like building a muscle.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. Now, one of the most common fears that tends to hold us back, I think, is the fear of judgment, that worry about what other people are going to think.
Oh, yeah. The fear of judgment is a big one, especially like today, right?
Mm.
With social media, and it feels like everyone's watching and judging everything we do.
It's so true. And the book actually addresses this directly with what it calls the spotlight effect, which basically says that we tend to way overestimate how much other people are actually paying attention to us.
Wait, so you're telling me people aren't actually out there, like, analyzing my every move, judging every little flaw?
Not even close. The reality is most people are so caught up in their own lives, their own insecurities, they don't have the time or the energy to be that concerned with what we're doing.
That is so freeing to hear. You're right, we create these stories in our heads like we're under a microscope, but really, everyone's too busy worrying about their own reflection to even notice our imperfections.
Exactly, exactly. And so the book encourages us to embrace this mindset of nobody cares. And not in a cynical way, but in a way that's really liberating.
Okay.
It's about focusing on doing your best work, being authentically you, and letting go of that need for external validation.
I love that. So instead of letting that fear of judgment hold us back, we can just, put ourselves out there, take action, knowing that most people are too busy to even notice.
Exactly. And then if that fear feels particularly strong, the book suggests trying out the Batman effect.
Oh, yeah, the Batman effect. I wanted to hear more about this one.
So this one is interesting.
It
It's
is.
about creating alter egos to help you embody the qualities that you need to face your fears.
Right. And I think this is where the book talks about Adele, the singer.
Yes.
She uses this technique, right?
Exactly. So she created this alter ego, Sasha Carter, to help her overcome stage fright.
Oh.
Right.
So it's like you step into this character, this more confident, capable version of yourself
Yeah.
that allows you to sort of push past those mental blocks.
Exactly. And there's actually research that shows that even just imagining ourselves as a superhero can boost our self-control and our perseverance, when we're faced with a challenge.
Wow. That's amazing. So we really can, like, tap into a different part of ourselves, a more empowered and resilient part to get us through those tough moments.
Yes, exactly. And it sounds kind of silly, right? But there's real power in harnessing our imaginations that way.
I love it. Okay, so we've talked about the energizers,
Mm.
play, power, and people. And we've dug into some of those blockers like fear and uncertainty. Is there anything else that the Feel Good Productivity book covers?
Yeah, they actually talk about one more blocker, and that's inertia.
Oh, and nurse.
That feeling of being stuck,
Oh, yeah.
lacking the motivation to get started on things.
Ugh. Yeah. And nurse is the worst. It's like, I know I should get started on that project, but I just can't seem to, like, find the energy.
Right.
It's so frustrating.
And the book argues that a lot of times this feeling of inertia is really rooted in a lack of energy, whether that's physical, emotional, or mental. It's like our internal battery is just drained
Oh.
and we haven't,
That makes sense.
recharged it.
It's not about willpower. It's not about forcing ourselves to do things when we're running on empty. It's about addressing that, like, underlying energy leak.
Exactly,
Wow.
exactly. And so they suggest really focusing on three main areas: physical energy, emotional energy, and mental energy.
Okay, so let's break those down. What are some of the key insights for boosting our physical energy?
Yeah, this one's probably the most straightforward, but it's amazing how often we let these things slide. So the book talks about the importance of getting enough sleep, eating nutritious foods, and moving our bodies regularly.
Yeah,
It sounds so basic,
it does.
but it makes such a difference.
It makes a world of difference. I know for me, when I'm sleep deprived or I've been, like, living off of junk food, I feel it everywhere. My focus is shot, my creativity tanks, and I just feel Sure.
Exactly. We can't expect our minds to be, firing on all cylinders if we're not taking care of our bodies. Even small changes like going for a walk during your lunch break or, swapping out that sugary afternoon snack for something a little healthier can have a big impact.
Yeah, it's about creating those healthy habits that really support us, both in the short term and the long term. Okay, so we've talked about physical energy. What about emotional energy? That feels a little less tangible. Like, how do we go about boosting that?
It's really about cultivating positive emotions, managing stress effectively, and building resilience. So it's about creating that inner landscape that's more, resilient to all the inevitable ups and downs.
Right, because when we're emotionally drained, it's hard to find the energy to do anything.
Exactly. Exactly. And one of the simplest but most powerful practices the book recommends for this is gratitude.
Oh, I love gratitude.
Yeah.
It's so easy to get caught up in that negativity bias, you know, like focusing on what's wrong or what's missing. But when we take the time to just like appreciate the good, it shifts everything.
Absolutely. It's about training our minds to focus on the positive. And that has a ripple effect on our emotions, our well being overall. And something else that's so important for emotional energy is self compassion.
Oh, tell me more about that.
Yeah.
Self-compassion is a big one for me because I think, especially in today's culture, it's easy to be so hard on ourselves.
Yeah.
We make mistakes or we don't live up to some expectation we have and we just beat ourselves up.
Yes, it's so true. And that negative self talk is so draining.
It is.
The book really encourages us to treat ourselves with the same kindness and understanding that we would offer to a friend, who's going through a tough time.
It's about being our own cheerleader instead of our own worst critic.
Yes, exactly.
I love that. Okay, so we've covered physical energy, we've talked about emotional energy. What about that final piece of the puzzle, mental energy?
Yeah, so mental energy is all about focus, attention, and clarity. It's about training our minds to be more present, more engaged, and less susceptible to all the distractions that are constantly vying for our attention.
Which feels increasingly challenging, I think, in our world. Like, I
Hmm.
constantly feel like I'm battling notifications, emails, the endless scroll of social media.
Right.
It's exhausting.
It's so true. And the book suggests a few strategies for this. One of them, which I know you've probably heard a lot about, is mindfulness meditation.
Yes. Mindfulness, I've heard so much about it, but I'll be honest, I'm kind of intimidated by it. It just seems like it requires so much time and discipline and.
It can feel that way, but it doesn't have to be complicated at all. Mindfulness is really just about paying attention to the present moment without judgment. So, noticing our thoughts, our feelings as they come up, but not getting swept away by them.
Okay. So it's about creating that space between our thoughts and our reactions.
Yeah.
Like having that ability to just sort of observe without getting totally carried away by the current.
Exactly, exactly. It's a skill, it takes practice. But even just a few minutes of mindfulness meditation each day can make a big difference in our ability to manage our attention, to manage our emotions more effectively.
That makes me feel a lot better and less intimidated by the whole mindfulness thing.
Yeah.
Okay, so beyond mindfulness, what are some other things that the book talks about for managing our mental energy?
Yeah, it talks about creating an environment that really supports focus. So this might mean setting boundaries with technology,
Oh, yeah.
creating a dedicated workspace, free from distractions, maybe even establishing clear routines and rituals that signal to your brain it's time to focus.
Oh, that's huge. Yeah, it's about being intentional with our environment and creating those cues for ourselves. I know for me, even just having a space that is only for work, where I don't do other things, it really helps my brain to like switch into that mode.
Exactly. Exactly. It's about those associations. And another technique they talk about is the Pomodoro technique. Have you heard of that one?
Oh, yeah, the Pomodoro technique. That's the one where you work in those timed sprints, right?
Exactly. You work for like 25 minutes on a single task, take a short break, and then repeat. Super simple, but it can be really effective for improving focus, preventing burnout.
Yeah, it's like giving yourself permission to take breaks without feeling guilty about it. They
Exactly.
don't have to be on all the time.
Exactly. Exactly.
Okay, so we covered a lot of ground today. We talked about those energizers of play, power, and people. And then we dug into some of those blockers like fear, uncertainty, inertia. Whew, what a journey.
It's been quite the deep dive, and I think the biggest takeaway here is that productivity is not about pushing ourselves to the limit, ignoring our well-being. It's about creating the conditions for both to thrive.
It's about working with our natural rhythms and energy levels, not against them.
Right.
And recognizing that well-being isn't separate from productivity. It's actually the foundation.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. And if there's one thing I hope our listeners take away from this deep dive, it's that, you have the power to design a work life that is both productive and fulfilling.
I love that. Such a good reminder. Well, thank you so much for joining me on this incredibly insightful deep dive.
Yeah.
Until next time.